I would say that Europe missed the opportunity in the 1990s to build a new sustainable post-Cold War security system. The situation we find ourselves now indicates the failure of the European security architecture that was established at that time. This failure results from several misjudgments and decisions made both in Russia and Europe, which we don't have now at the moment, or I don't have time to analyze more. But in any case, Russia's aggression against Ukraine and Trump's new US foreign policy have exposed the weakness of the European security architecture created after the Cold War. And we are now living that dilemma in the whole Europe as well in the Northern Europe. At the same time, it has become uncomfortable clear that unless the security political solution is found in Europe that includes Russia and to which it commits, Europe will continue to be unstable. In this scenario, the relationship with Russia is built on a growing military deterrence and the reinforcement of enemy images on both sides, leading us into a Cold War second. This would have a heavy price for all of Europe, its social system, political stability, and the realization of human rights and democracy, not only in Russia but also in the European Union, as we actually already have seen. The consequences for Russia's political development are not even worth speculating about. We also cannot afford to include in wishful thinking that we might wait for the collapse of Russia or the Putin administration, because the administration is more than just the Putin as a person. As merely responding to climate change requires such significant economic investments that their implementation cannot be reconciled with acceleration and increasingly costly armament. If I try realistically outline what Russia's place is likely to be in the European security system, we must return to the war. The manner in which the war in Ukraine ends will significantly define Europe's future relationship with Russia and the construction of the European security system. There are increasingly more options for how it might end, although there are, of course, differences in the likelihood of their realization. If Russia and Ukraine continue now starting or restarting peace negotiations, their outcome, of course, could certainly also alter the scenarios I'm going now to present. I see that the war could end in roughly one of the following ways, each of which would significantly affect the European security system and Russia's place within it. The first one is, of course, peace negotiations, now or later, which could lead to the path culminating in a peace agreement that will undoubtedly be very difficult for Ukraine and likely involve territorial concessions. However, it would result in an agreement that de facto defines the broader European security architecture and the relationship between Europe and Russia. The role of the coalition of willing, led by France and Britain, in the post-war situation in Ukraine will significantly shape the formation of the European security system. Although new borders and possible security policy constraints relating to Ukraine, I mean military non-alignment demand what Russia has presented so the no NATO policy, are defined in the peace agreement. They will be contested both in Ukraine and Europe after the agreement. And demands for their alteration will be subject of political disputes for decades. It is also likely that they will cause diplomatic and political crises between Russia and Ukraine and between Russia and Europe. This requires a platform like the OSCE or something like that, where European countries can discuss political issues, compliances with the agreement, and attempts to find solutions to problems. The second alternative is the ceasefire. That ceasefire is established during which negotiations continue but do not lead to a peace agreement. A situation similar to Cyprus or Korea or frozen conflict in different parts of the former Soviet Union, where frozen conflicts emerge, where a ceasefire is followed by an arms ties, and a demarcation line is formed that is susceptible to provocations and to re-emergence of hostilities. It becomes a de facto but not de jure recognized boundary. Internationally, it is not recognized as a new border between Ukraine and Russia, which means the continuation of permanently higher level of tension between Europe and Russia and the possibility of the war resuming. This leads to the continuation of spiral of strong militarization in Europe and Russia and the maintenance of high-level military tension. It also impacts the social situation and political stability in Europe, as significant military acquisitions are financed by cutting other public sector spendings, likely increasing social inequality and political radicalism. This continuation of this neoliberal politics. And the third possibility, alternative is, and the worst option for Ukraine is the collapse of its front. What is unfortunately very much possible. If Ukraine's human and economic resources are exhausted as the war drags on. This would lead to the possible Russian military breakout on part of the front and the loss of the remaining negotiating positions Ukraine currently holds. For Europe, this would mean a total and final failure of its Ukraine policy and a state of permanent uncertainty. It would also lead to the state of division in Europe, where those who pursued the failed policy would pay a heavy political price. It would likely also result in significant losses of positions of current major parties, so-called people's parties in various European countries. The previous option could also lead to the similar consequences, I must add. But in this and the previous option, Russia remains a permanent destabilizer of Europe as it responds to the NATO's growing military superiority, includes asymmetrical means in addition to military means ultimately based on nuclear weapons, what Heikki already very well described it. Russia's I would say unlikely, that is the fourth alternative. Russia's unlikely but long hoped for during the war collapse or change of power that reverses the situation, forcing Russia to pay for the destruction caused by the war and bringing Putin before the International Criminal Court is what we have wished and what many politicians have, based their politics pretty much. If a change of power occurs, it is more likely to be a planned and controlled transition by insiders rather than a direct ousting of Putin. However, Putin's removal is also possible if the ruling elite forms a new coalition when Putin becomes burden to them. This option, along with the signing of peace agreement, is of course another possibility that would theoretically open a way to creating a new relationship between Russia and Europe and shift the focus from unilateral military deterrence to seeking political means to stabilize the situation. What would then be Europe's interest and what can it expect from the future development? All alternatives are pretty much bad, I would say, during the nearby perspective. Somehow little bit better than others, but of course we morally and politically we can say that ending the war is the number one and the most important, probably the most important thing, especially if we are thinking the Ukraine and Ukrainians and their future. As a starting point, I take the scenario from the options presented above, where Ukraine and Russia have signed the peace agreement. It may also be concluded by the next president succeeding Zelensky. We have seen many signs for that in the United States and in Ukraine as such, and in some well-informed media and analytics. The agreement is deemed in Europe as unjust, dictated by the stronger party, and thus, although legitimate and stabilizing the European security situation one way, it has also deemed it politically and morally wrong and undesirable. Of course, it would be just that. That would mean that relations between Europe and Russia remain tense, marked by mutual distrust, exacerbated by Russia's efforts to increase its military power on its western borders, including Finland's eastern border and northern maritime areas, northern seas, as it has started. As it has stated for years before Finland and Sweden joined NATO. This leads to the emergence of a new era of higher level military tension in Northern Europe and the Arctic region, where the Nordic countries and Russia must seek a balance in the level of mutual military deterrence. Here, the so-called security dilemma must be considered of what Heikki already talked so much that I don't repeat it, but it's one key point and key issues what we have to be able to solve. Falling into spiral of escalating arms race is of course undesirable, but as long as increasing security through trust building political measures is not on the agenda, the negative spiral continues. In Russia, it also has the effect of increasing militarism, the continuous narrowing of democracy and human rights, and its repression against the opposition. The creation of enemy images, conservatism, and xenophobia are also consciously used to divert the attention of the population suffering from economic problems elsewhere. The end of the war, however, opens the door at least slightly to the use of means other than military deterrence. The removal of visa restrictions and at some point the opening of Finland's eastern border for human movement and economic activity, as well as some level of cross-border cooperation between Russia and its western neighbors, the gradual allowance and revival of educational and cultural sector contacts between Europe and Russia, civil society contacts, will likely be among the first tools in the repertoire of so-called citizens' diplomacy and soft influence. And we have to remember that currently the situation is that Putin's administration has sought to limit Russians' connections to the West, or in all sectors. It's their policy, not what actually this policy, what we have conducted, all these restrictions have only supported. As a conclusion, I present as a long-term scenario that our interest is, of course, to try to build a relationship with Russia as much as possible based on means other than increasing military deterrence, whatever the situation is, because in the squeeze of power politics dominated by the United States, China and Russia, particularly small European states face only losses and have limited space for independent policy in this situation. After the end of the war, there will be room for policies that balance and mitigate military confrontation and tension growth. They are also the only means by which the situation can be turned better for people if we are speaking about broader security issues. And now I refer, among other things, to where funds are cut to achieve the 5% defense budget and so forth. And we have to try, and it's our interest, try to seek measures to reduce military risks. So I think that perhaps to make even the first baby steps, we need some kind of organizations and institutions like OSCE revitalizing that kind of system, because I don't find any better solutions to that. And finally, as a professional historian, I would add to this context that although all speak and talk about the nature of Putinism and Russia, I would say that if we be able to manage to coexistence with Stalin after the World War II, we in Europe should be able to do better now with Putin and Russia.